If you have ever been told that digestive problems are just a normal part of getting older, bloating, constipation, unpredictable digestion, food you used to tolerate without a second thought now causing trouble, I want to offer you a different frame. Those things are common in adults over 60. Common is not the same as inevitable. And the gap between those two words is where the research on gut health in older adults has been doing some of its most important work over the past decade. Before we go any further, an important note. This channel is for general education, not medical advice, and I am not your doctor. Nothing here is a diagnosis, a prescription, or a treatment plan. If you are experiencing persistent digestive symptoms, pain, bleeding, significant changes in bowel habits, unexplained weight loss, please see your physician. Those are conversations that need to happen in a clinical setting. With that said, let me walk you through what the science now understands about the aging gut, why it changes, and what the research most consistently identifies as the practical levers for supporting it. Because the gut at 70 is not simply a deteriorating version of the gut at 40, it is a different environment, one that responds to the right inputs just as reliably as ever once you understand what those inputs are. Tell me your age in the comments right now. I read them, and knowing who is in this community shapes what I cover next. And stay with me through the third section, because the gut connection that research keeps uncovering there is the one almost no one in this age group has been told about, and it changes the way the rest of this conversation lands. Here is what is actually happening inside the gut as the body ages, because the mechanism matters more than the symptom list. The gut is not a simple tube. It is an ecosystem, one of the most complex biological ecosystems in the known world, housing somewhere between 38 trillion and 100 trillion individual microbial organisms, more than 700 distinct species, collectively referred to as the gut microbiome. For most of adult life, this ecosystem maintains a kind of dynamic balance, diverse, resilient, populated by a community of organisms that collectively help digest food, produce vitamins the body cannot make on its own, regulate the immune system, manage inflammation, and all, through a communication pathway called the gut-brain axis, influence mood, cognition, and even sleep. That balance is not static. It responds to everything: what you eat, how you sleep, how much you move, what medications you take, how much stress you carry, and, critically, how old you are. The research consistently finds that the microbiome undergoes measurable changes with age. Diversity declines. The populations of certain beneficial bacteria, particularly the genera Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus, which produce short-chain fatty acids that are essential for gut lining integrity and immune regulation, tend to decrease. Populations of more inflammatory or opportunistic organisms tend to increase. At the same time, several other structural changes are happening. The muscles of the digestive tract, or the ones responsible for the coordinated wave of contractions called peristalsis that moves food through the system, lose some of their speed and force. The lining of the gut itself undergoes changes in the tight junctions between cells, the proteins that hold those cells together like a sealed seam. When those junctions loosen, larger particles can cross the gut lining into the bloodstream, a condition researchers refer to as increased intestinal permeability. The immune response to those particles contributes to the low-grade systemic inflammation that underlies a remarkable range of age-related health problems: cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, metabolic dysfunction, joint deterioration. The gut is not peripheral to those conditions. In an important biological sense, it is upstream of them. And understanding that relationship changes how you think about what a digestive complaint actually is. Bloating after a meal is not just a comfort issue. It may be a signal that the fermentation balance in the colon has shifted, that the organisms processing that food have changed in composition, and the byproducts of their activity are different from what they used to be. Constipation is not just a mechanical inconvenience. It is often a sign that the organisms producing the short-chain fatty acids that drive colonic contractions have declined. Increased sensitivity to foods that were once tolerated without difficulty is frequently a sign of a less diverse, less resilient microbial community, one that has lost the functional redundancy that allowed it to handle a wide range of inputs. None of this means the symptoms are imaginary or untreatable. It means they have specific biological causes that specific inputs can address. That is a different and more useful frame than simply accepting them as the price of getting older. So the question is, what does the research say you can actually do about this? The answer is not a supplement. It is not a single food. It is a set of consistent inputs, each of which addresses a different part of this aging ecosystem. And when you understand why each one works, you will understand why consistency matters more than perfection. The first and most consistently supported input is dietary fiber, specifically the types of fiber that feed the beneficial organisms in the large intestine rather than simply adding bulk. These are called prebiotics, and the distinction between a prebiotic and a simple laxative fiber is important. Laxative fibers like psyllium add bulk to the stool and draw water in, which helps with transit, useful but limited. Prebiotic fibers, found in foods like garlic, onions, leeks, asparagus, Jerusalem artichokes, slightly underripe bananas, and oats, are fermented by the gut microbiome into short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, propionate, and acetate. Butyrate is the primary fuel source for the colonocytes, the cells lining the colon, and it plays a direct role in maintaining the integrity of the gut lining. When butyrate is abundant, the tight junctions between colonocytes stay tighter. When it is scarce, as it tends to become when the bifidobacterium populations that produce it decline with age, those junctions loosen and intestinal permeability increases. A systematic review published in Gut, one of the leading journals in gastroenterology, found that prebiotic supplementation in older adults consistently increased bifidobacterium populations, improved stool frequency and consistency, and reduced markers of intestinal permeability. The practical point: if you are over 60 and you are not consistently eating foods that contain these prebiotic fibers, you are not feeding the organisms your gut lining depends on. That is not a minor gap. It is the primary structural input that keeps the gut ecosystem producing the compounds it needs to maintain itself. The simplest starting point is adding 1 or 2 prebiotic-rich foods to the meals you are already eating, not as a dramatic overhaul, but as a consistent addition. A clove of garlic in whatever you are cooking, a small portion of oats at breakfast, half a banana at a moderate ripeness. These are not glamorous interventions, they are foundational ones. And the research on what happens when prebiotic fiber intake increases consistently in older adults is worth holding on to. In a 12-week controlled trial published in the journal Gut Microbes, older adults who increased their prebiotic fiber intake through food showed not only increased bifidobacterium populations but also measurable improvements in processing speed on cognitive assessments, a finding that reflects the gut-brain axis in action. The microbiome changes influencing the brain through signaling pathways that run directly between the enteric and central nervous systems. The gut is not just feeding itself, it is feeding the organs sitting at the top of the system. That connection runs in both directions, and the food choices that support one consistently support the other. The second lever is live fermented foods, the probiotic side of the equation, as opposed to the prebiotic. Probiotics are live microorganisms that, when consumed in adequate quantities, provide a health benefit to the host. The research on probiotic supplements is mixed and complicated. The effects are highly strain-specific, the dose matters enormously, and many commercial products do not survive the acidic environment of the stomach in sufficient numbers to colonize the colon. Fermented foods are a different story. Traditional fermented foods: plain unsweetened yogurt with live active cultures, kefir, kimchi, sauerkraut, miso, deliver live organisms along with the fermentation metabolites those organisms have already produced, which appear to have their own independent effects on gut lining function and immune signaling. A landmark study published in Cell in 2021, conducted at Stanford University by researchers Justin Sonnenberg and Christopher Gardner, directly compared a high-fiber diet to a high-fermented food diet in healthy adults over 10 weeks. The fermented food group showed a significant increase in microbiome diversity, the metric most consistently associated with gut health and resilience across the aging research literature, while the high-fiber group showed more variable results, with diversity increasing in some participants and decreasing in others depending on their baseline microbiome composition. The fermented food group also showed measurable reductions in 19 markers of immune activation, including proteins associated with chronic systemic inflammation. This is not a small finding. It is a direct, experimentally controlled demonstration that fermented foods change the gut microbiome and reduce systemic inflammation in adults through a pathway that does not require a prescription or a specialist. For older adults particularly, where baseline microbiome diversity has already declined, regular fermented food consumption appears to be one of the most effective tools available for rebuilding that diversity. A daily serving of plain yogurt with live cultures or a small portion of sauerkraut alongside a meal is enough to begin that process. The key word here is daily. Intermittent fermented food consumption produces intermittent benefit. Consistency is the dose. If this is landing for you, type the number 3 in the comments right now. It helps this content reach more seniors who need it. The third lever is the one almost no one in this age group has been told about directly, and it is the connection I wanted you to stay for. It is water, not in the general sense of staying hydrated, though that matters too, in the specific mechanistic sense of what water does inside the colon. The colon's primary job is to absorb water from the material that arrives from the small intestine. It does this constantly, and the balance it maintains between absorbing too much and too little determines the consistency, transit speed, and comfort of everything that follows. Here is what changes with age. The colon becomes more aggressive at water absorption over time, partly because the mucus layer lining the colon, which normally protects the epithelial cells and lubricates transit, thins and becomes less robust. This is one of the primary structural reasons constipation becomes more common after 60, independent of fiber intake, independent of medication side effects, independent of activity level. The material moves more slowly, more water is extracted, and the result is harder, drier stools that require more muscular force to pass, which strains the pelvic floor and the colonic musculature over time. A 2020 review published in Nutrients examined hydration status and gut function in adults over 65 and found that even mild chronic underhydration, the kind that does not produce obvious thirst in older adults because the thirst mechanism becomes less sensitive with age, produced measurable increases in colonic transit time and intestinal permeability. The practical target, based on the best available evidence, is approximately 6 to 8 cups of fluid per day for most older adults, with the specific amount adjusted based on body size, activity level, climate, and any medical conditions affecting fluid balance. A conversation worth having with your doctor if you are unsure. Plain water is the most effective form. Coffee and tea count toward the total but have a mild diuretic effect at higher quantities. The timing matters more than most people realize. Drinking a glass of water within the first 30 minutes of waking activates a reflex called the gastrocolic reflex, which stimulates colonic contractions, the same reflex responsible for the urge to have a bowel movement after coffee. Water alone produces a version of this reflex, more gently but reliably enough to be the simplest, most underused gut support strategy available. The fourth lever is physical movement. And here the mechanism is direct enough to be worth explaining carefully because the gut exercise connection is more specific than simply being active is good for you. The intestinal musculature, the smooth muscle that produces peristalsis, is not under your conscious control. You cannot decide to contract it. It is regulated by a separate branch of the nervous system called the enteric nervous system, sometimes called the second brain, a network of more than 100 million neurons embedded in the wall of the gut from the esophagus to the rectum. This network communicates directly with the central nervous system, and it is sensitive to both physical activity and the compounds produced during exercise. During and after moderate intensity physical activity, a brisk walk, light resistance training, cycling, the body increases production of serotonin, and roughly 90% of the body's serotonin is produced in the gut, where it acts as the primary signal for peristaltic contractions. More activity means more serotonin availability, means more regular, stronger peristaltic movement. A meta-analysis published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine found that regular moderate intensity physical activity in older adults produced significant improvements in constipation symptoms and colonic transit time, effects that persisted independently of dietary changes. The threshold is not dramatic. 30 minutes of moderate walking 5 days a week was sufficient to produce meaningful improvement. That is not a high bar, but it is a consistent one. Consider a woman in her early 70s, call her someone who had dealt with constipation for years, tried multiple over-the-counter remedies with inconsistent results, and eventually began a daily 30-minute walk, primarily for cardiovascular reasons. Within 4 to 6 weeks, her digestion had become more regular than it had been in years. She had not changed her diet substantially. She had changed her movement pattern. Her physician, when she mentioned it at her next visit, was not surprised. The enteric nervous system responds to physical input as reliably as any other target organ. Giving it that input consistently is one of the most durable things you can do for gut function in this age group. And there is a secondary mechanism worth understanding here. Exercise also reduces systemic cortisol over time, the stress hormone that, when chronically elevated, directly suppresses the populations of beneficial gut bacteria and increases intestinal permeability. The gut is exquisitely sensitive to the stress response chemistry of the body it lives in. A nervous system that is chronically in a state of low-grade activation, the kind produced by chronic worry, isolation, or disrupted sleep, signals through cortisol and adrenaline pathways that the gut recognizes as danger and responds to by downregulating the functions associated with peaceful, efficient digestion. Regular moderate exercise interrupts that cycle. It is one of the few interventions that simultaneously benefits the enteric nervous system directly and reduces the stress response chemistry that impairs it. The fifth lever, and the one that connects everything else, is sleep. The gut microbiome has its own circadian rhythm. It is not a metaphor, it is physiology. The populations of different bacterial species in the gut fluctuate across a 24-hour cycle, with different organisms dominating at different times of day in response to feeding patterns, light exposure, and the hormonal signals that regulate the body's internal clock. When sleep is disrupted, when the circadian rhythm is misaligned, whether through irregular sleep timing, insufficient duration, or the light exposure patterns common in modern life, the microbial circadian rhythm is disrupted with it. A 2019 study published in Cell Host and Microbe found that even a single night of sleep deprivation produced measurable shifts in gut microbiome composition in healthy adults, with reductions in lactobacillus species and increases in inflammatory-associated organisms. Those shifts partially reversed after recovery sleep. But in older adults whose microbiome is already less diverse and less resilient, repeated disruptions accumulate in ways that do not fully reverse. The circadian gut connection runs in both directions. Poor sleep disrupts the microbiome, and a disrupted microbiome, particularly one with reduced butyrate production, impairs the gut-brain signaling that regulates melatonin synthesis and sleep architecture. It becomes self-reinforcing. The practical implication is that sleep hygiene is not separate from gut health. It is part of gut health. A consistent sleep and wake schedule, a dark and cool sleep environment, limiting food intake in the 2 hours before bed, these do not just protect the brain and the cardiovascular system. They protect the gut ecosystem that protects everything else. If your sleep has been troubled and you have also noticed changes in your digestion, that is not a coincidence. It is a conversation worth bringing to your doctor because both systems can often be addressed through the same interventions. There is also a practical gut-specific sleep consideration that is worth naming directly. Eating large meals close to bedtime significantly disrupts both sleep architecture and nocturnal gut function. The digestive system follows its own circadian preference. It is most efficient at processing and absorbing nutrients in the first 2/3 of the waking day, and least equipped for it in the hours immediately before sleep. Eating heavily at 9 or 10 in the evening does not simply cause discomfort. It forces the gut microbiome to work during the window it is biologically programmed to rest, which interferes with the microbial housekeeping processes, including the repair of tight junctions in the gut lining that happen predominantly during the fasting and sleeping hours. Moving the last substantial meal of the day earlier, not dramatically, even an hour, is one of the simplest and most underappreciated gut health habits the research supports. Here is the picture when you bring all 5 of these together. You are feeding the specific organisms that produce the compounds your gut lining needs to stay intact. You are reintroducing microbial diversity through fermented foods. You are providing the hydration that keeps the colon functioning without extracting too much from the material it is processing. You are giving the enteric nervous system the movement signal it needs to keep peristalsis regular. And you are protecting the circadian environment that the entire ecosystem depends on for its own biological rhythm. None of these five things is a supplement. None of them requires a prescription. All of them work by restoring inputs that the gut was designed to receive, and that modern life and the particular changes of aging have reduced or eliminated. The research on gut health in older adults is some of the fastest moving science in medicine right now, and the direction it keeps pointing is not toward more complex interventions. It is toward consistency with fundamentals. A starting point for this week: pick one of these five levers that you know is underdeveloped in your current routine. Just one. Add one prebiotic food, or begin eating plain yogurt daily, or start your morning with a glass of water before anything else, or add a daily walk. Hold that one addition for 3 weeks before adding another. That is the pace the research suggests produces lasting change rather than short-term effort that fades. There is a principle in behavioral science called habit stacking, attaching a new behavior to something you already do reliably. The glass of water goes next to the coffee maker, so it happens before the coffee. The yogurt goes in the spot where you already reach for breakfast. The walk happens at the same time as a phone call you were going to make anyway. The gut does not need dramatic intervention. It needs consistent inputs delivered at a pace that the habits around them can actually sustain. Small, held. That is the formula the evidence supports. Which of these five surprised you most? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if someone in your life is dealing with digestive issues they have been told are simply part of aging, share this with them. Next, I want to walk you through what the research now understands about the connection between the gut microbiome and cognitive decline, and why what is happening in the gut in your 70s may be one of the most important predictors of what happens in the brain in the decades that follow. Watch that one next.